Captain Tom Harper had seen countless planets in his years as a soldier for the Galactic peacekeepers. He'd fought in distant systems, dealt with all kinds of aliens, and faced dangers no one could imagine. But nothing could have prepared him for the strange encounter he had one quiet day in space. Tom's ship, the Sentinel, was floating through a desolate part of the galaxy, far from any known civilizations. The mission was simple: monitor this empty sector and make sure no one was causing trouble. It was a routine job, the kind he'd done 100 times before. As he sat in the command chair, eyes on the quiet stars outside, a sudden alert blared across the control panel. Something had been detected on a nearby planet. A distress signal, weak and barely noticeable. Tom's fingers flew over the controls, his instincts taking over. He opened a channel to his crew. "Get ready for a detour. We've got a distress signal coming from that planet," Tom ordered. The crew moved quickly, adjusting course to head toward the source of the signal. As they approached, the planet appeared barren, deserted landscapes stretching out as far as the eye could see. It didn't look like anyone would be alive there. But the distress signal was clear enough to catch Tom's attention. As they descended into the planet's atmosphere, Tom could feel his heart beating faster. What would they find down there? The signal was still active, but it was getting weaker. They couldn't afford to waste any time. "Prepare for landing," Tom said, his voice calm but filled with anticipation. The Sentinel landed on a rocky plain, surrounded by dust and wind. The crew suited up and began to move out. Tom led the team, his boots crunching on the rough ground. They moved towards the coordinates the distress signal had come from. It wasn't far, just a few hundred meters away. They reached a small clearing where the wreckage of an escape pod lay. It was damaged, half buried in the dirt, but the signal was still coming from it. Tom approached carefully, his pulse quickening. What had happened here? Inside the pod, the sight was shocking. A small alien infant, no older than a year, lay curled up in a blanket. The child's skin was pale, almost translucent, with faint blue markings across its face. Its eyes, large and bright, were open, staring at Tom. The child made a soft gurgling sound, as if calling out to him. Tom knelt down, his mind racing. Who would leave a baby here? Why had this child been abandoned on a deserted planet? The baby didn't look like any species Tom had ever encountered. It was unlike the many different alien races he'd met in his time in the Peacekeepers. Its eyes were bright, almost glowing in the dim light. The markings on its skin were strange, as if they held some kind of significance, but Tom couldn't figure out what they meant. He reached out cautiously, and the baby's small hand grasped his finger. Tom's heart softened. The child was in danger, alone in a broken pod on a hostile planet. Without hesitation, he gently picked up the baby and cradled it in his arms. He felt an overwhelming urge to protect the tiny creature, a bond forming instantly. "We need to get it back to the ship," Tom said, his voice firm. The crew was silent as they watched him carry the child back to the Sentinel. None of them knew what to make of it. They had seen strange things in their travels. But a baby like this, it was beyond anything they had ever expected. Once they were back on the ship, Tom took the child to the medbay. The ship's doctor, Dr. Marilyn, was waiting. She took one look at the baby and began scanning it with the ship's medical equipment. This is unlike anything I've ever seen," Dr. Lin murmured, her voice filled with awe. "The child is in perfect health. Its biology is, well, it's almost human, but not quite." Tom sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding the baby in his arms. He looked down at its innocent face, wondering where it had come from. How had it ended up on that planet, alone and abandoned? As Dr. Lin worked, Tom's mind began to race. He had to know more. The distress signal had come from somewhere. Someone had sent it. But why? And who was this baby? "I think we should keep it," Tom said suddenly, his voice firm. Dr. Lin looked up at him, surprised. "Keep it? Tom, we have no idea what we're dealing with. We don't even know if this child is safe. "I don't care," Tom replied, his voice filled with resolve. "No child deserves to be abandoned like this. I'll take care of it." Dr. Lin studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but we need to figure out more about where it came from." Tom knew she was right. There were too many questions and not enough answers. But for now, the most important thing was that the child was safe, and that was all that mattered. As Tom sat in the medbay, rocking the baby gently in his arms, he felt something deep inside him shift. A protective instinct had awakened, one he hadn't felt before. This child wasn't just another mission, another assignment. It was something more, something important. He glanced down at the baby once more. "I'll keep you safe," he whispered, "no matter what." Little did Tom know, this simple act of kindness would change the course of his life and the fate of the entire galaxy, forever. Days passed, and Captain Tom Harper found himself thinking about little Lyra more and more. The baby had become a constant presence on the Sentinel, and though his crew remained curious and cautious, they couldn't help but be drawn to her. The strange alien child had a way of captivating everyone with her wide, bright eyes and the soft, gurgling noises she made when she was happy. She had become an odd sort of comfort in the otherwise cold, mechanical environment of the ship. Tom spent most of his time in the ship's medbay, watching over her. Dr. Marilyn had made it clear that there was little she could do medically. The child appeared perfectly healthy, yet there was something about her that didn't fit any known species in the galaxy. Her rapid growth was the most puzzling. In just a few days, Lyra seemed to be learning at a rate that was far beyond what should have been possible for any child her age. One morning, Tom entered the medbay to find Lyra sitting up on her own, something she hadn't done the day before. Her small hands reached out to him, and as he picked her up, she looked directly into his eyes. It was as though she was trying to tell him something, though no words came. "Hey there," Tom said softly, a smile tugging at his lips. "How are we doing today?" Lyra responded with a little cooing sound, and for a brief moment, Tom felt a sense of peace. It was hard to explain, but in those quiet moments, he felt a connection to her, as if she was more than just a lost child. She had been abandoned, yes, but there was something in her gaze, a quiet intelligence, that made Tom wonder if she was meant for something more. As the days turned into weeks, Lyra's abilities became more apparent. Her physical strength grew at an astonishing rate. She could lift objects that were too heavy for a child of her size, and she would often play with the crew's equipment, showing a curious and almost natural talent for understanding how things worked. It wasn't just her physical abilities that were extraordinary, though. She began to speak, first in gibberish, and then in a language that none of the crew could understand. Dr. Lin had tried several times to decipher it, but the words seemed to come from a place far beyond anything the galaxy's translators could recognize. One evening, as Tom sat with Lyra in his quarters, she looked up at him with her bright blue eyes, and then, for the first time, she spoke in clear, though broken, words. "Papa?" she asked, her voice soft and childlike. Tom froze. He hadn't expected that. No one had. Lyra had been using sounds and coos, but this was something entirely different. It was the word Papa, but it was so clearly spoken that Tom could hardly believe it. "Papa," Lyra repeated, her tiny hand reaching out to him. Tom felt a wave of warmth spread through him. It was as if a bond had been sealed. He didn't know what it meant, but the way she said it, so innocent, yet so meaningful, hit him like nothing else had. "I'm here," Tom whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of surprise and love. "I'm here, Lyra." From that moment on, it became clear that Lyra wasn't just growing rapidly in size and strength. She was becoming something else entirely. Tom began to notice strange things happening when she was around. Small objects would move when she focused on them, and sometimes, when she was upset, lights would flicker or equipment would malfunction. It wasn't clear how or why, but Lyra seemed to have some sort of influence over the ship itself. One night, As the Sentinel traveled deeper into the galaxy, the crew noticed something even stranger. Lyra had begun to mimic words, not just the ones she'd heard from Tom, but the ship's communication system as well. The crew was gathered in the mess hall when Lyra suddenly spoke a sentence that none of them could understand, except for Tom. "Urakithan, Kiloth," she said, her voice clear and deliberate. Tom's heart skipped a beat. The language was alien, but the words were unmistakable. It was a dialect from a distant corner of the galaxy, the same dialect used by the rulers of the Galactic Empire, the very empire that controlled countless systems. Tom couldn't believe it. "Did she?" Dr. Lynn started, her voice barely a whisper. Tom nodded slowly. "Yeah, she just spoke the ancient language of the Empire." The implications of what had just happened were overwhelming. Lyra wasn't just any alien child. She was speaking the language of a people that had once ruled over the galaxy. The Galactic Empire, once a dominant force, had been fractured long ago. But the language, the dialect, was still known, passed down by the few remaining descendants of the Empire's royal bloodline. Tom stood up, his mind racing. What was Lyra trying to tell them? Was she somehow connected to the Empire's royal family? Could this baby, this child who had been abandoned, be the heir to a lost empire? The crew gathered around Tom, their faces filled with confusion and concern. No one knew what to say, what to think. "How is this possible?" Dr. Lynn asked. "How could she speak that language?" Tom looked down at Lyra, who was now playing with a small tool, her attention fully focused on it. It was as if she hadn't just spoken a language that no one had heard in centuries. She seemed unaffected by the discovery, almost as if it was no big deal. "I don't know," Tom admitted, "but I think we're dealing with something far bigger than just a lost child." As the crew exchanged looks of worry and curiosity, Tom realized that their mission had just changed. The child he had rescued was not just an innocent life to protect anymore. She was someone important, someone powerful, and Tom was determined to find out exactly who she was. Captain Tom Harper sat in his quarters, staring at the stars outside the Sentinel. His thoughts were consumed by one question. Who was Lyra? She had shown so much potential in the few weeks since he had found her. She was more than just an alien child. She was something special. But what did it mean? And why had she been abandoned on a dead planet? Tom had no answers, but he knew he couldn't rest until he had them. He looked down at Lyra, who was sitting on the floor, playing with a small metal object. She had grown so quickly, and every day brought more surprises. Just the other day, she had fixed a broken piece of equipment by simply looking at it and focusing. Her abilities were beyond anything Tom had ever seen, and the more time passed, the more he felt he was caring for someone far more important than just a helpless child. As the ship drifted through deep space, a sudden alarm broke Tom's concentration. The Sentinel's communication system flared to life with an urgent signal. It was a direct transmission, not something they usually received. "Captain Harper, this is Tavor of the Imperial Fleet. You are harboring someone who does not belong to you. Release the child immediately. You will comply." The cold, authoritative voice sent a chill down Tom's spine. The name Tavar meant something. He recognized it immediately. Tavar was a commander in the remnants of the Galactic Empire. Tom had heard of him, but he never expected to encounter him in this way. Tom quickly activated the ship's communication system. "Who are you, and why are you contacting me?" he demanded, his voice firm. Tavar's response came almost instantly. "You have taken something that belongs to us, human. The child you have rescued is not some lost soul. She is the last living heir to the Galactic Empire. You are harboring royalty." Tom felt his heart race. The Galactic Empire. He glanced over at Lyra, who was now looking up at him with wide, innocent eyes. Her identity was more complicated than he could have ever imagined. "She has no home," Tom said, trying to sound confident. "She was abandoned. She's just a child. I'm not handing her over to anyone." You do not have a choice. Tavar's voice cut through the line, cold and commanding. We will be there in 3 hours. If you do not comply, you will face the consequences. Tom's hands clenched into fists. He didn't know who this Tavar was or how much power he had, but Tom wasn't going to give up Lyra without a fight. He had made a promise to protect her, and he intended to keep it. We'll see about that, Tom muttered under his breath. He turned to Dr. Marilyn, who had entered the room after hearing the conversation. She looked just as worried as he felt. This is serious, Tom, she said, her voice trembling slightly. The Galactic Empire, they control entire systems. If they find out about Lyra, they'll want to use her. We can't let that happen. I know, Tom replied, his mind already working through the possibilities. But we can't just hand her over. We'll have to fight. Dr. Lin nodded. I'll help you prepare. We'll need everything we've got. In the hours that followed, Tom and his crew went into high alert. They fortified the ship, making sure every system was in working order. The crew checked their weapons and ensured that the escape pods were ready in case they needed to leave quickly. The tension was thick, and no one spoke much. Each of them knew the danger they were facing. Meanwhile, Tom spent as much time as he could with Lyra. He had never considered himself a father figure, but when he looked at her, he felt something stronger than just duty. He felt a deep, protective love that he couldn't explain. She had become more than just a mission. She was a part of him now, and there was no way he would let anyone take her from him. As the time ticked down, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Tavar's voice had been too calm, too certain. It didn't make sense. Why hadn't the Imperial fleet arrived already? What was Tavar planning? Then, just as Tom was about to go back to the command center, an alert came through. Another ship had entered their sector. This one was much larger than the Sentinel, and its design was unmistakable. It was an Imperial warship. The crew gathered in the command center, staring at the screen in silence. The warship was slowly moving toward them, its weapons powered up and ready. Tom's gut tightened. The situation was far worse than he had anticipated. This is it, Dr. Lin whispered. They're coming for her. We'll fight, Tom said firmly, though his mind raced with worry. He had always been a soldier, but this was different. This wasn't a battle against an enemy force. It was a battle to protect a child who might hold the key to the galaxy's future. As the warship drew closer, the communication system crackled again, and Tavar's voice came through once more. Captain Harper, you are making a grave mistake. Do not resist. If you hand over the child now, we can avoid bloodshed. Tom's jaw tightened. I'm not handing her over. You're going to have to take her from me. There was a long pause before Tavar responded, his voice colder than ever. Then you will pay the price for your defiance. Prepare yourself, human. You will not escape the wrath of the Galactic Empire. The transmission cut off, and Tom knew it was time to act. The battle had begun, but his focus remained fixed on one thing: keeping Lyra safe. No matter the cost, he would not let anyone take her from him. The Sentinel was silent as Captain Tom Harper stood at the front of the command center, his hands gripping the edge of the control panel. The Imperial warship loomed just outside, its dark shape a reminder of the power that the Galactic Empire still held. Tom had always been ready for combat, but this felt different. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for Lyra. Captain, Dr. Marilyn said, her voice urgent. They're locking onto our ship. If they fire, we won't last long. Tom nodded, his mind racing. They didn't have the firepower to take on an Imperial warship head-to-head. The Sentinel was fast, but it wasn't a fighter. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. Prepare for evasive maneuvers, Tom ordered. Get to the weapons control. We'll have to outsmart them. The crew moved quickly, their faces tense but determined. The tension in the room was palpable, and Tom could see the fear in their eyes. But there was no time for fear. Not now. He had to protect Lyra. He turned to look at her, She was sitting in the corner of the command center, her small figure almost hidden behind the large equipment. Lyra had grown so much in such a short time, but there was still something so innocent about her. She had no idea what was going on, but Tom could see that she knew something was wrong. Her bright eyes were wide, her little hands clenched into fists, as though she could sense the danger approaching. "Stay here, Lyra," Tom said, his voice softer now. "We'll keep you safe. I promise." She looked up at him and smiled, her eyes still bright with that unexplainable spark. It made his heart ache, and for a moment he hesitated. But then he turned and ran to the control panel, focusing on the battle ahead. "Captain," Dr. Lin's voice was strained. "The Imperial ship is firing. They're trying to disable our engines." Tom's heart skipped a beat. The first blast hit the Sentinel, shaking the entire ship. Alarms blared as the crew scrambled to keep everything intact. The ship's hull groaned under the pressure, but it held. Just barely. "Brace for impact," Tom shouted, grabbing the control stick and pulling hard. The Sentinel veered sharply to the right, narrowly avoiding a second blast. The ship rattled, but they were still intact. "Good work," Tom said, breathing a little easier. "Now let's give them a fight they won't forget." He switched the controls to the weapons system and fired back at the warship. The Sentinel's weak lasers barely scratched the surface of the massive Imperial ship, but it was enough to get their attention. The warship fired again, its blasts powerful enough to rattle the ship with each hit. "We can't keep this up," Dr. Lin called out. "Their weapons are too strong." Tom gritted his teeth. He knew they couldn't win in a straight-up fight, but they didn't need to. They just needed to survive long enough to get away. "Is the escape route ready?" Tom asked, his mind already working through the escape plan. "We're ready," Dr. Lin replied, "but we'll need to be fast." "Do it. Now." The crew scrambled to prepare the escape pods, ready to abandon ship if necessary. Tom glanced back at Lyra one last time. She was still sitting where he'd left her, her eyes focused on him. He knew that she was the most important thing here. The Empire wanted her, but Tom wouldn't let them take her. He turned back to the controls. They needed to create a diversion, something to throw the Imperial ship off balance long enough to escape. "All right," Tom said, determination in his voice. "We're going to make a run for it." With a deep breath, Tom hit the thrusters to full power, sending the Sentinel speeding toward the Imperial warship. It was a dangerous move, but it was the only one they had. The Imperial ship's weapons fired again, but Tom was already executing a series of evasive maneuvers, dodging the blasts with sharp turns and sudden bursts of speed. The warship fired again, but this time, Tom was ready. He pulled the Sentinel into a sharp dive, sending the ship plummeting toward the planet below. The Imperial ship followed, but the Sentinel was faster, slipping through its firing range as it shot through the atmosphere. "Hold on," Tom shouted as the ship plummeted toward the surface. The ship's engines screamed under the pressure as they raced through the planet's atmosphere, narrowly avoiding collisions with massive rocks and debris. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as the ship veered left and right, narrowly dodging each blast that came their way. They couldn't keep this up much longer. Then, just as the Imperial ship began to lose its lock on them, Tom slammed the control panel to the side, sending the Sentinel into a controlled crash landing. The ship hit the ground with a bone-shaking thud, the engine sputtering as the ship slid to a stop. The crew was shaken but alive. Tom didn't wait for anyone to check the damage. He grabbed Lyra, who had been tossed from her seat during the crash, but was miraculously unharmed. He held her tightly as the crew scrambled to gather their gear. "We have to move," Tom said, his voice urgent. "The Empire won't be far behind." Dr. Lin nodded, helping the others to their feet. "We'll need to find shelter fast." Tom turned to Lyra, her wide eyes staring up at him. He didn't know where they were or how they were going to survive. But one thing was certain: no matter what, he wasn't going to let anyone take her from him. As they hurried off the ship and into the unknown, Tom realized that their fight was far from over. The battle for Lyra's freedom had just begun. The Sentinel was lost, its once proud hull now a wreck on an unknown planet. Tom Harper had never planned for this, but here they were, stranded in the wilderness, with no way to contact the rest of the galaxy. The crew had managed to escape the wreckage, but the danger was far from over. The Imperial warship was still out there, and they had no idea how much time they had before it found them again. As the crew set up a temporary camp, Tom watched the horizon, his mind focused on one thing: keeping Lyra safe. She had been so quiet since the crash, sitting in his arms with wide, confused eyes. She had no idea what was happening, but Tom could feel her fear. He could feel it too. "Captain," Dr. Marilyn called, pulling him from his thoughts. She was crouched beside the wreckage of the Sentinel, inspecting the ship's damaged systems. "The ship's power systems are completely fried. We're not going anywhere unless we fix it." Tom frowned. "We don't have time for that. We need to find shelter, someplace the Empire won't find us." "I agree," Dr. Lin replied. "But we also need to figure out how to defend ourselves. We have no idea how long we'll be here." Tom glanced at Lyra, who had fallen asleep in his arms. Her tiny chest rose and fell gently, as though the world around her wasn't falling apart. He wished he could shield her from the dangers that loomed. But there was no time to rest. The Empire was still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had Lyra. "We'll scout the area," Tom said, standing up. "Stay here and keep watch. I'll take a few of the crew and find a safe place. We'll be back before dark." Dr. Lin nodded, and the crew set to work. It was a strange, uneasy calm as they prepared for the unknown. They knew they had to move quickly, but no one could forget the fear that gripped them. The Empire was ruthless, and Tom had no illusions about how far they would go to take Lyra back. As Tom and the crew made their way into the dense jungle, the sounds of alien creatures filled the air. The planet seemed alive with strange, distant noises, chirping, buzzing, and howling from deep within the forest. The air was thick and humid, and Tom could feel the sweat begin to bead on his brow. This was no place to linger. "Keep your eyes peeled," Tom ordered. "We don't know what's out here." The crew moved cautiously, their weapons ready. It didn't take long before they found a small clearing, a sheltered area surrounded by tall, thick trees. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp, at least for now. "We'll rest here for a bit," Tom said, lowering himself to the ground. "Dr. Lin, what do you think? Safe enough?" Dr. Lin looked around carefully. "It's quiet, but that doesn't mean it's safe. We'll need to keep watch at all times." Tom nodded. The crew set up a small camp, the crackling of a fire the only sound breaking the silence. Lyra, still sleeping, rested in Tom's arms. He felt a deep protectiveness for her, an instinctual need to keep her safe no matter what. As the sun began to set, the sky turning a deep shade of orange, Tom felt a wave of worry wash over him. The Empire was out there, searching for them. He had no doubt they would stop at nothing to find Lyra. And yet, as he looked at her peaceful face, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. She was safe for now, and that was all that mattered. That night, the crew took turns keeping watch, the fire flickering as the wind blew through the trees. Tom couldn't sleep. His mind kept racing, thinking of the next move, the next danger. But each time he looked down at Lyra, she calmed him, reminding him of what he was fighting for. In the stillness of the night, Tom finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. How had everything changed so quickly? Just weeks ago, he had been a soldier on a routine mission, flying through the galaxy with his crew. And now, here he was, fighting to protect a child he had found by chance, a child who may hold the key to a powerful empire's survival. He didn't know what Lyra's future held, but he knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, he would stand by her. He would protect her until the end. Morning came, but the danger was far from over. The crew began to pack up their camp, knowing they couldn't stay in one place for too long. The longer they stayed, the more likely it was that the Empire would find them. Tom's mind raced with plans, ideas, and possible escape routes, but each one seemed more dangerous than the last. "We need a plan," Dr. Lin said, her voice steady but serious. "We can't keep running forever." Tom nodded. He knew she was right. They needed to make a decision. But what were their options? They couldn't fight the Empire directly. They didn't have the resources or the firepower. They could try to hide, but the Empire had vast resources. They could track them down anywhere. "Maybe it's time we find out who Lyra really is," Tom said quietly. "Maybe we need to understand her, and what she means to the Empire." Dr. Lin looked at him. "You think she's more than just an heir to the Empire?" "I don't know," Tom admitted, "but I feel like we're missing something. There's something about her. I don't think she's just a child. I think she has something the Empire needs." They were all silent for a moment, each of them lost in thought. Finally, Dr. Lin spoke again. "Then we need to find out what that something is, and we need to do it before the Empire finds us." Tom nodded. He had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. The battle for Lyra was far from over. They would have to make choices that could change everything. But no matter what happened, Tom would keep his promise. He would protect Lyra with his life. The jungle was quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. Tom Harper knew that the Empire was not far behind. The crew had barely managed to escape with their lives, and the Sentinel was gone, broken, abandoned, and unlikely to ever fly again. They were on their own now, stranded on an alien planet with no way of knowing what would come next. Tom looked over at Lyra, who was sitting near the campfire. She was no longer the frightened, confused child he had found in the wreckage of the abandoned ship. Over the past few days, she had grown more confident, her wide eyes now full of curiosity instead of fear. She seemed to understand that something important was happening, though she didn't yet know what it was. Her ability to sense the world around her, her strange, almost magical connection to things, still baffled Tom. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that Lyra wasn't just an ordinary child. There was something about her that made her different, something that the Empire wanted at all costs. He glanced at Dr. Mara Lin, who was sitting beside him, her face troubled. "We need answers, Tom," she said quietly. "If we're going to survive, we need to understand who Lyra really is. What is it about her that the Empire would risk everything to find?" Tom stared at Lyra, thinking deeply. "I don't know, but I think we're getting closer. She's not just some princess or heir to a throne. There's something inside her, something powerful. And if the Empire gets their hands on her, they'll use her for whatever they want." "I know," Dr. Lin replied. "But what if she's not just a weapon? What if she's the key to something else? Something bigger?" Tom looked at her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "What if the Empire doesn't just want her to rule?" Dr. Lin said, her voice growing more serious. "What if they need her to unlock something? Something that could change the galaxy? Maybe she's the key to restoring the Empire, or even destroying it." Tom felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had always thought of the Empire as a dying power, something that had been broken and scattered after the fall of its great leaders. But if what Dr. Lin said was true, then Lyra wasn't just a survivor of the Empire's fall. She could be the cause of its rebirth, or its destruction. He didn't have the answers, but they needed to find them, and soon. The next few days were spent in constant motion. They couldn't stay in one place for too long, not with the Empire surely closing in. Tom and the crew had to stay one step ahead, always moving, always looking for shelter. Every new day brought fresh challenges, and Tom found himself growing more and more desperate for a solution. Meanwhile, Lyra's abilities were growing stronger. She had started to communicate with them in ways that were beyond her years. It wasn't through speech, but through an intense, almost telepathic connection. Tom could feel it when she focused on him, like a pulse in the air around them, a strange sensation that both comforted and unsettled him. She had an inner power that was both beautiful and dangerous, a force that he didn't fully understand. One evening, as the crew sat around the fire, Lyra suddenly stood up, her small body glowing faintly in the dim light. She looked at Tom with an intense gaze, her eyes sparkling with something he couldn't explain. "Lyra?" Tom asked, his voice gentle. She didn't respond with words, but her thoughts seemed to reach out to him, clear and sharp. It wasn't a voice in his head, more like a feeling, an impression of what she wanted to say. "She wants us to go south, Tom. She wants us to find the temple." Tom blinked, confused. "The temple?" he asked, turning to Dr. Lin, who looked just as puzzled. "What is she talking about?" Dr. Lin frowned. "I don't know. There are no records of any temples in this area. But if Lyra is leading us there, maybe it's important." Tom didn't know what to think. It felt like they were being guided by some unseen force, one that was stronger than anything he had ever encountered. But he had no choice but to follow her lead. Lyra was the key to everything, and if she was telling them to go south, then that was what they would do. The next morning, they packed up camp and began their journey. The landscape was wild and untamed, a jungle filled with strange creatures and unfamiliar dangers. But Lyra moved with confidence, as if she knew the path they had to take. Her small feet seemed to glide across the ground, avoiding obstacles effortlessly, and the crew followed in her wake. Hours turned into days, and the deeper they traveled into the jungle, the more Tom felt like they were getting closer to something. The air grew heavier, the trees taller, and the landscape more mystical. It was like they were entering a place that had been forgotten by time itself. Every step brought them further from the world they had known, and closer to something that could change everything. Finally, they came upon it. A massive structure stood before them, half hidden by thick vines and overgrown foliage. It was a temple, just as Lyra had led them to. The architecture was unlike anything Tom had ever seen, alien, ancient, and impossibly beautiful. The walls were covered in symbols and markings that seemed to shimmer in the light, as though they were alive. Lyra stepped forward, her small hand reaching out toward the temple. Tom couldn't help but feel a sense of awe wash over him. This place was old, much older than anything the Empire had built. It was something forgotten, something powerful. And it was clear that Lyra had brought them here for a reason. "This is it," Tom whispered. "This is where it all changes." Dr. Lin stepped up beside him. "Do you think she knows what's inside?" "I don't know," Tom said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I think we're about to find out." With Lyra leading the way, they stepped into the temple, not knowing what lay ahead, but knowing that whatever it was, it would change everything. The air inside the temple was heavy, cool with an ancient, timeless energy. Tom Harper's footsteps echoed through the vast, silent halls. He had never seen anything like this before. The walls were covered in strange carvings, glowing faintly with a light that seemed to come from nowhere. There was a sense of power here, something old and forgotten. The deeper they went into the temple, the more Tom could feel it, pressing in on him from all sides. Lyra was ahead of him, her small feet moving with a purpose. She was different now. She wasn't the frightened child he had found on that wrecked ship. She was something more, something he didn't fully understand. But there was no doubt in his mind that she was the key to everything. Her abilities were growing stronger, her connection to this place undeniable. She knew what they had to do. "Stay close," Tom said softly to the crew behind him, his voice low in the quiet temple. Dr. Marilyn was just a few steps behind, scanning the surroundings with caution. Her face was tense, her eyes darting from one strange symbol to another. "This place, it's unlike anything I've ever seen. It's like it's been hidden for centuries. Why would Lyra lead us here?" Tom glanced down at the little girl who had stopped at the end of the corridor. She was looking at something, her gaze fixed on a stone pedestal in the center of the chamber. The pedestal was empty, but there was something about it that seemed to draw her in, as if it was calling to her. Without a word, Lyra walked toward it. Tom's heart raced. He didn't know what was happening, but he felt an overwhelming urge to follow her. She reached the pedestal and stood there for a moment, her hand stretched out toward the air above it, as though she was waiting for something to happen. Then, as if in response to her presence, the air shimmered. A soft, melodic hum filled the chamber, and the pedestal seemed to come to life. The carvings on the walls glowed brighter, and a low rumble echoed through the stone. Something was awakening, something ancient, something powerful. "What's happening?" Dr. Lin whispered, her eyes wide with shock. "I don't know," Tom answered, his voice barely a whisper, "but it's all connected to her." Suddenly, the floor beneath them shifted, and a hidden passageway opened in the stone. A door, ancient and covered in more glowing symbols, slid apart slowly, revealing a hidden room beyond. The air inside was thick with energy, almost like the room itself was alive. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes wide but calm, as if she had always known this moment was coming. Tom moved quickly to catch up, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he was about to face, but he knew they couldn't turn back now. Lyra had brought them here for a reason, and he had to trust her. Inside the room, a massive stone altar stood at the center. It was surrounded by more glowing symbols, and above it, a massive orb of light floated, pulsing softly as if alive. Tom's breath caught in his throat. The orb was beautiful, strangely beautiful, and yet it held a sense of foreboding. It was clear that this was no ordinary artifact. This was the heart of the temple. Lyra moved toward it, her small hand reaching out to touch the glowing orb. Tom froze, instinctively stepping forward to stop her. But before he could reach her, the orb flared brightly, sending a wave of energy through the room. A blinding light surrounded Lyra, and for a moment, Tom could see nothing but the intense glow. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the light faded. Lyra stood there, her eyes wide with wonder, but her face now full of understanding. She had changed somehow, more grown up, more confident. She looked at Tom, and for the first time, he saw something new in her eyes. Knowledge. She knew something. She had learned something that no one else could. Tom stepped forward cautiously, reaching out to her. "Lyra," he said softly, his voice full of concern. "Are you okay?" Lyra smiled up at him, but it wasn't just a smile. It was a smile of someone who had seen things, understood things that were beyond him. She didn't need words to explain it. The power of the orb was in her now, and it had unlocked something deep inside her, something the Empire had been searching for. "I know now," Lyra whispered, her voice calm, but with a strength that startled Tom. "I know who I am." Tom's heart raced. "What do you mean?" "I am the last of the true rulers," she said, her voice steady. "I am the key to the Empire's power, and I can either rebuild it or destroy it." Tom stared at her, his mind trying to process the weight of her words. "The Empire? You mean the Galactic Empire?" Lyra nodded. "The one that was once great, but it fell. I was hidden, kept away. Now the Empire wants me back, to use me. But they don't understand. I have the power to either save it or make sure it never rises again." Tom's mind raced. Everything was starting to make sense, but it also felt like it was spinning out of control. The Empire had wanted her for a reason, but what if she was more powerful than they ever knew? What if she could bring about the end of the Empire's reign? Or worse, what if the Empire used her to bring about something even worse? "Lyra," Tom said urgently, "we need to be careful. If the Empire finds out what you can do—" "I know," Lyra interrupted, her gaze unwavering. "I'll protect us. But first, I need to learn more about what this power means, about how to control it." Before Tom could respond, the walls of the temple began to shake. A low rumble, almost like thunder, echoed through the stone. Something was coming. "They found us," Dr. Lin whispered, her voice filled with fear. Tom looked at Lyra, who nodded, a determined look in her eyes. "We need to leave," she said. "Now." But as they turned to leave, The temple's doors slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. Tom's heart pounded as he realized that they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the future of the galaxy.